What would you do if a wild animal you rescued years ago suddenly showed up at your door? When a young woman risked her life to save a helpless bobcat cub trapped in a raging forest fire, she thought she'd never see it again. But 5 years later, on the coldest night in rural Oregon, something scratched at her cabin door, and what stood outside left her speechless. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about the bond between human and wild, forged in flames and tested by time. Stay tuned, because what happens next will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Where the fire found her. When instinct told her to run, she chose to turn back, and changed 2 lives forever. The sky was on fire. Thick, angry smoke curled through the air above Deschutes National Forest, turning daylight into a dim orange haze. Trees crackled in the distance, flames licking up their trunks like greedy hands. Ash rained down in hot flakes, coating everything with a choking layer of dust. Lena Carpenter tightened the straps of her fireproof vest and adjusted the scarf over her face. She stood alone near the edge of the Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehab Center, heart pounding beneath her gear. Her radio crackled, voices urging her to evacuate now. But she wasn't done yet. At 27, Lena was a quiet but determined wildlife volunteer. Petite, with shoulder-length auburn hair tied back beneath her hood, she was known for staying calm when others panicked. Maybe it was foolishness, or maybe it was something deeper, but Lena couldn't leave. Not yet. Most of the center's animals had already been evacuated: rabbits, owls, foxes, even a pair of baby deer. The remaining staff had packed up and gone just minutes ago. Only Lena remained, double-checking cages and making sure no creature had been left behind. She had just turned to leave when she heard it. A high-pitched cry, sharp, desperate, coming from the woods just beyond the fence line. She froze. Another cry followed, this one weaker, fading fast. "Please don't be what I think it is," she whispered, already breaking into a run. Dodging burning branches and ducking low under smoke, Lena pushed into the tree line. Her boots sank into hot, blackened soil. The fire hadn't reached this part yet, but it would soon. Then she saw it. Tangled in dry brush beneath a fallen log was a small creature, no larger than a house cat, with ash-dusted fur and paws curled inward. It was a bobcat cub. Grayish-brown, speckled with faint spots, its body trembled with exhaustion. Its green eyes locked onto her with something between fear and hope. Lena didn't hesitate. From her pack, she pulled out a silver fire blanket, crouched low, and slowly wrapped the cub inside. It let out one soft whimper, then stilled. The smoke was thicker now. Trees cracked above her. Cradling the cub against her chest, Lena turned and ran. By the time she reached the access road, the last transport truck was already gone. Flames danced at the edge of the clearing. A fire crew spotted her and waved frantically. She ran to them, breath ragged, legs shaking. "What the hell are you carrying?" one firefighter shouted. She unwrapped the blanket just enough to show the tiny spotted head. "Bobcat," she gasped. It was alone. The man stared at her. Then he nodded once and pulled her into the back of the truck. As they roared down the dirt road toward safety, Lena clutched the bundle close, whispering through the smoke. "I've got you, little one. I've got you." Ash begins again. Not all creatures fear humans, some remember who reached into the fire for them. The emergency shelter outside Bend, Oregon, smelled of singed pine needles, wet fur, and antiseptic. The makeshift triage center, set up in a cleared field behind a fire station, bustled with exhausted volunteers and frightened animals. But one corner of the tent remained hushed, reserved for the smallest survivor of Deschutes. Wrapped in a worn flannel towel inside a plastic crate, the bobcat cub barely moved. Lena hovered close, kneeling beside the crate, her fingers resting gently against the bars. She had stayed with the cub through intake, refusing to leave even after paramedics insisted she be checked for smoke inhalation. His breathing was shallow, eyes half-lidded, but he was alive. They treated his burns, mostly blistered paws, and started fluids for dehydration. A vet tech offered a name suggestion, could call him Ember. But Lena shook her head. Ash, she whispered. His name is Ash. She stayed in the camp for 2 nights, curled on a cot beside his crate, feeding him formula with a syringe. He hissed at first, spitting with the tiny strength he had. But hunger softened his instincts. By the 3rd night, he took the milk without protest. On the 4th, he nudged her hand after feeding and let out a rough, kitten-like chirp. That night, Lena wept for the first time since the fire. Over the following weeks, Ash was moved to a quieter facility on the outskirts of Redmond. Lena, though just a volunteer, was granted limited access thanks to her involvement in his rescue. She visited every few days. He grew stronger quickly, eating solids, playing with branches, climbing low perches in his enclosure. But he never growled at her. Never ran. He watched her with wary eyes, yes, but he recognized her. Not as an enemy. Not as a stranger. As something else. For Lena, their connection was unlike anything she'd felt. She had worked with fox kits, deer fawns, even a rescued cougar once. But Ash was different. He met her gaze in a way that felt human. As though he understood why she had come into the fire for him. The rehab team reminded her daily, he's wild. Don't get too close. But wild didn't mean incapable of memory. After 6 months, Ash was deemed ready for release. They tagged his ear, fitted a tracker, and drove him deep into a restricted part of protected forest land near the Cascades. The gate opened. He stepped out slowly, then broke into a graceful trot and vanished into the underbrush. He didn't look back. Lena stood watching until the sound of his paws faded. Stay wild, she murmured, her breath catching in the mountain air. But no, you're not forgotten. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that Ash had remembered too. And one day, he would return. The quiet that hides everything. In the silence of the woods, loneliness echoes loudest, until something answers. 5 years passed. The fire faded into memory, replaced by other emergencies, other headlines. Deschutes recovered in time. Trees grew back. Ashes turned to soil. But some things didn't regrow. Lena Carpenter left the Wildlife Center a few months after Ash was released. She didn't tell many people where she was going, just packed her things into her old Jeep and drove north along the winding Cascade Mountain roads until she found solitude. She bought a narrow strip of land just outside Sisters, Oregon. A weathered cedar cabin sat near the edge of a small creek, surrounded by Douglas firs and snowberry bushes. The town was quiet, the kind of place where people waved but didn't ask questions. That suited her fine. At 32, Lena lived alone. No roommates. No pets. No visitors. She liked it that way. Her days were simple: wake before dawn, make coffee on the wood stove, log into her job as a remote conservation biologist, and spend her breaks walking the tree-lined trails that bordered her land. Her work revolved around tracking elk migration data, studying camera footage of black bears, and writing reports no one really read. But the animals didn't need praise. They just needed someone to see them. Evenings were filled with books and the warm scent of burning cedar. She taught herself to bake bread. Learned how to split logs with one clean swing. Took comfort in the rhythm of being alone. And then winter came. It wasn't the snow that surprised her, she expected that. It was how suddenly the snow turned cruel. By January, the storm had buried the mountain roads, silencing everything under a thick white blanket. Days passed without sun. Nights dropped below zero. Lena was prepared. She had generators, firewood, canned food, but even she couldn't ignore how quiet the world had become. Too quiet. She noticed the tracks one morning in the fresh snow. At first glance, she thought they belonged to a lynx or perhaps a large fox. The prints were delicate, but deep, pressing cleanly through the snow like a signature. They moved along the edge of the tree line behind her cabin, looped near the woodpile, then disappeared toward the east ridge. She studied them for several minutes, brow furrowed beneath her wool cap. They weren't coyote. The stride was wrong. Definitely not deer. Something feline. Lena's breath came in soft puffs as she crouched to inspect them closer. There was a pattern to the prints. A pacing. Not a predator stalking prey, but something, searching. The next day, more tracks. This time closer to the porch. On the third day, the prints circled her cabin completely. That night, Lena triple-checked every lock, though she didn't know why. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more primal, an awareness that something was watching. Not malevolent, not threatening. Just, present. The storm worsened. Snow rose past her knees in places. She cleared the porch each morning with a shovel just to keep the door from freezing shut. And still the tracks came. Always in a wide arc. Always close, but never seen. One evening, as wind howled like wolves outside and sleet peppered the windows, Lena sat in her rocking chair near the fire, cradling a mug of herbal tea. A single oil lamp burned beside her. The power was out again. Generator fuel was getting low. She wasn't afraid. She had done this before. But she was lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that came from missing parties or crowds. No, Lena had long since made peace with that. This was a different kind of loneliness. The kind that whispered at you between the cracks in silence. The kind that made you glance at the window for no reason. The kind that made you think of old names, old faces, and one pair of green eyes you hadn't seen in years. Ash. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in months. Maybe longer. After his release, she had followed his tracker signal for a while. The Wildlife Center had shared the data with her, out of respect. But he'd eventually moved beyond the range. Or the collar had failed. Or, he was gone. She chose not to ask which. But now, as the fire popped and the storm screamed, something twisted in her chest. She thought of his tiny body curled against hers in a smoky rescue truck. She thought of his half-grown form trotting away into the underbrush, never looking back. She thought of his eyes, sharp, wild, but aware. Then came the sound. Soft. Deliberate. Out of place. Scratch. Scratch. Not a tree branch. Not ice breaking. It came again. Lena rose slowly, every instinct on edge. She walked to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Then, scratch. Scratch. 2 beats. A pause. 2 more. She unlatched the top half of the split door and opened it just a few inches. Wind whipped in, stinging her face. Snow blew across the porch. And standing in the center, framed by the storm, was a bobcat. Her breath hitched. The firelight from inside flickered against his pale fur. He was tall now, his body lean and powerful, fur thick and dusted with frost. His eyes glowed with green light. And on his right ear, a scar. Lena's voice caught in her throat. Ash? He blinked. Once. Slowly. She opened the door wider. He stepped inside. The visitor in the snow. She saved him once in fire. Now he returned to her through ice. The knock wasn't really a knock. It was a sound so strange, so out of place, that Lena thought at first she was imagining it. 2 soft scratches. Then silence. The storm outside was still howling, white winds whipping across the trees that surrounded her isolated cabin in the outskirts of Sisters, Oregon. It had snowed nearly 2 feet in the past 24 hours, and the clouds promised more. Power had gone out again earlier that day. The generator sputtered to life for the 3rd time, giving just enough light for the living room to glow gold with firelight. She rose slowly from her worn leather armchair, wrapping a thick wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Snow boots were lined up by the front door, but she didn't bother slipping them on. Her heart was already racing. She didn't know why. Scratch. Scratch. Again. This time, clearer. She approached the door with cautious steps, each one pressing softly against the wooden floor. The fire popped behind her. The wind screamed beyond the walls. She unlatched the top half of the split front door and opened it just a crack. What she saw made the breath catch in her throat. A bobcat stood there, still as a statue, coated in frost and moonlight. He was large now, easily 35 pounds, with a thick winter coat of pale gray fur dappled in black rosettes. His paws were caked with ice, and snow dusted his back like powdered sugar. A faint scar curled over his right ear. But it was the eyes that told her. Green. Clear. Familiar. Ash? Her voice came out a whisper, cracked by disbelief. The bobcat didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He didn't run. He blinked, slowly. One long, deliberate blink. Lena's hand trembled on the door. She didn't know what to do. Every part of her brain told her this wasn't right. Wild animals didn't come back. They didn't remember people after 5 years. They didn't walk through snowstorms and scratch at doors like family coming home for the holidays. And yet, he had. Carefully, she opened the door wider. The cold rushed in immediately, biting at her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. Ash stepped forward once. Twice. His movements were measured, almost hesitant, but not fearful. As he crossed the threshold into the warmth of her home, she took a step back to give him space. He paused beside the hearth, his side gently rising and falling, then laid down on the wooden floor as if he had always belonged there. Lena just stared. She didn't speak again for several minutes. She couldn't. Eventually, she knelt beside him. The fire's glow lit the contours of his face, reflecting off his sleek fur. She could see the snow melting on his whiskers, the dirt on his pads. He looked healthy, strong, wild, absolutely, but not feral. He watched her with quiet calm. Not a test. Not a threat. Recognition. Lena reached a hand out, just inches, and held it there. Ash didn't move. His tail flicked once. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and rubbed his head, not quite against her, but near her leg. Just enough to touch the edge of the blanket she wore. Tears welled behind Lena's eyes. She hadn't cried in a long time. You remembered, she breathed. After all this time. Ash shifted slightly, adjusting his body closer to the fire, but never once taking his eyes off her. She sat cross-legged beside him, heart thundering in her chest. The storm outside intensified, whiting out the windows, howling like a beast lost in the trees. But inside that cabin, it was quiet, almost sacred. A silence wrapped in heat and memory. For hours, neither of them moved much. Lena didn't dare. She brought out a shallow bowl of water, setting it a few feet away. Ash sniffed it once and drank slowly. She noticed then that his fur was damp in places, not just from snow, but from something thicker. She leaned closer, squinting in the firelight. Near his flank, below the ribs, a patch of fur had been matted with blood. Not fresh. But recent. Ash, she said softly. You're hurt. He didn't react. She didn't try to examine him. Not tonight. The trust was fragile, even if it felt solid. A wild animal was still a wild animal. But a seed of worry planted itself deep in her stomach. Something had happened to him out there. She wrapped another log in the fire and leaned back against the wall, watching him drift into sleep. His body slowly relaxed, one paw twitching slightly in his dreams. And Lena, wrapped in that old blanket, stared at him with 1,000 questions swirling behind her tired eyes. Why had he come back? Why now? And more urgently, what had driven him out of the forest, bleeding and exhausted, to find her again? That night, she slept on the floor near the hearth, her back against the rocking chair, her eyes never straying far from Ash. In the morning, she'd get answers. But for tonight, she simply watched him sleep. And whispered into the firelight, "You came home." A call from the wild. When an animal returns to your door after 5 years, it's not a coincidence, it's a cry for help. The morning after Ash arrived, Lena awoke on the cabin floor with her back aching and her heart still unsure whether it had all been a dream. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft orange pulse across the walls. Her blanket was half off, one arm stretched toward the hearth. Ash was gone. For one sharp, disoriented moment, she sat upright, eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of him. Then she saw them, a trail of wet paw prints leading from the hearth to the front door, and out into the snow. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed her boots and coat, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp, so cold it sliced the inside of her nose. But the sky had cleared. The sun, weak but golden, touched the tree line to the west. Ash stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the last patch of open space, his thick coat glinting with frost. He was still. Watching her. Lena stepped off the porch and into the snow without thinking. Ash turned and walked toward the forest. Then he stopped. Looked back. Waited. Her breath caught. He was leading her. She grabbed her backpack from inside the door, already packed with field supplies, first aid gear, a flashlight, and a blanket, and followed him into the trees. They moved quickly through the woods, Ash ahead, Lena a few paces behind, ducking branches, pushing through knee-deep snow. The silence of the forest was immense, broken only by the crunch of her boots and Ash's quiet movement over the snowpack. Time seemed to blur. She didn't check her watch. She didn't need to. She trusted him. An hour passed. Maybe more. Then, at the bottom of a shallow, pine-lined ravine, Ash stopped. Lena hurried forward, and saw why. At first, it looked like a mound of dirty snow and tangled branches. But as she came closer, her breath caught. A bobcat. Larger than Ash. A female. She was partially hidden beneath a collapsed branch, her back leg twisted awkwardly under a log. Her side was marked by a deep gash, dried blood staining the snow beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Her head lifted weakly at Lena's approach, but she didn't growl. Didn't flee. And beside her, so small Lena nearly missed it, was a kitten. No more than a few weeks old. Its fur was thin, patchy, barely suited for the freezing air. It lay curled beside its mother, unmoving except for the faintest twitch of its tiny chest. Lena dropped to her knees, stunned. Oh my God. Ash stood to the side, silent, watching. This wasn't chance. This wasn't wild luck. He had come to her cabin. In a snowstorm. After 5 years. Not for shelter. But for this. He had come for help. Somehow, someway, he had remembered. And now, once again, Lena knew exactly what she had to do. Saving the silent ones. Nature doesn't beg with words, it pleads with eyes, with breath, with silence. Lena didn't move at first. The cold seeped through her jeans as she knelt in the snow, staring at the injured female bobcat and the tiny kitten curled beside her. The scene was silent except for Ash's soft, anxious pacing. He circled the pair once, then looked back at Lena, his eyes wide, not wild, but urgent. "I'm here," she said quietly. "I see them." Sliding off her backpack, Lena unzipped it and pulled out a foil emergency blanket. The baby, barely a few weeks old by the size of it, was breathing, but its body trembled violently. Too small. Too exposed. Its fur was thin, likely not yet fully weaned. The mother didn't move when Lena approached. Her eyes flickered open, barely tracking movement. The gash along her side had frozen at the edges, but dark blood still clung to her ribs. One back leg was pinned under a snow-covered branch, and Lena could see from the angle that it was broken. She reached slowly, her voice soft. "It's okay, girl. I'm not going to hurt you." Ash didn't growl. He didn't interfere. He stood just behind Lena, eyes locked on the female, tail twitching. The air felt impossibly still. Lena shifted the log gently. The bobcat let out a low, dry groan but didn't resist. She freed the leg and wrapped the kitten in the thermal blanket, tucking it close to her chest beneath her coat. The little thing was like ice. No time to wait. It needed warmth now. She looked at Ash. "I need your help again." He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. Lena scanned the ravine. No cell signal. No chance of dragging both cats out on foot. But she had brought a coiled rope and an emergency sled she used for hauling firewood, stored near the base of the hill. She marked the location with a bright orange flag and sprinted back through the woods. It took her 15 minutes, her lungs screaming by the end, but she returned with the sled, its canvas bottom slick and fast. She knelt again beside the female bobcat and carefully lifted her onto the sled using the silver blanket as a sling. The mother didn't resist. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. The kitten, still tucked against Lena's chest, stirred weakly. "Hang on, both of you." Lena secured the mother with rope and bungee cords, cushioning her sides with spare blankets. Ash trotted beside them as Lena dragged the sled through the snow. The return trip was harder, her legs burning, her back aching, but she didn't stop. An hour later, they reached the cabin. Lena opened the door with her boot, pulled the sled up onto the porch, and turned to Ash. "You brought them to me. Now let's keep them alive." Ash stepped inside, slow and silent, like he'd never left. "The fire burns for all. A wild heart will fight for survival, but sometimes it needs a quiet place to heal." Lena slammed the cabin door shut behind her, snow still clinging to her coat, breath coming in short gasps. She dropped to her knees beside the sled and carefully unwrapped the injured mother bobcat, her hands moving swiftly, but gently. Ash hovered near the fireplace, his body low to the ground but his eyes alert, watching every move. The kitten, wrapped tightly against Lena's chest inside her coat, let out a weak squeak. It was the first sound she'd made since the forest. Lena rushed to the corner of the room where she kept a storage crate of emergency animal care supplies, gauze, ointments, syringes, heating pads, and formula from her days volunteering at the Wildlife Rehab Center. The cabin was suddenly alive with urgency. It no longer felt like a place for stillness, but a battlefield for survival. She laid the mother bobcat on a folded sleeping bag in front of the fire and set a soft towel under the kitten, placing it beside its mother's belly. Then she warmed a small bottle of kitten milk replacer and offered it to the baby. It didn't latch right away. Lena's heart twisted. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "You have to fight." A moment later, the kitten began to suckle, slowly, clumsily, but with life. Lena exhaled with a shaky breath. The mother's breathing remained shallow, but consistent. Lena cleaned the wound on her side with antiseptic and gently applied a salve to keep it from freezing again. She splinted the injured leg using a broken paint stir stick and wrapped it with elastic bandage. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. She whispered as she worked, not even realizing she was doing it. "You're safe now. Both of you. You're safe." When she finally stood, her knees ached and her hands were raw from the cold, but the heat from the fire had spread through the room. She turned and saw Ash sitting near the hearth. Still. Quiet. Proud. He had stayed the whole time. Not once did he snarl or pace. He watched her work like he understood everything she was doing. Maybe he did. She sat on the floor beside him, her back against the wall. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of it all. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and outside, the wind howled like a memory trying to be heard. Ash looked at her. Not as a pet would. As something older. Deeper. As kin. "You trusted me again," she said softly. "And you were right." Ash turned back to the fire, tail curling around his paws. Lena leaned her head back against the wood-paneled wall, watching the flickering shadows play across the sleeping mother and her kitten. In the middle of nowhere, in the dead of winter, her cabin had become something it hadn't been in a long time. A sanctuary. When the forest says goodbye. Not every goodbye is the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of knowing you mattered. 3 months passed. The snow melted slowly, revealing damp earth and the first shoots of spring. The winds grew warmer, the air softer. Birds returned to the trees outside Lena's cabin, filling the mornings with gentle song. But inside, time moved differently. The mother bobcat, Lena had come to call her Willow, recovered with steady grace. Her leg, though not perfect, had healed enough for walking, climbing, even short sprints. She kept to herself mostly, but never showed fear of Lena. Only caution. Mutual respect. The kitten, now vibrant and curious, had doubled in size. She tumbled across the floor like a house cat, full of mischief and life. Lena had named her Juniper. Ash stayed for weeks. He slept near the fire every night and vanished into the woods each morning, only to return before dusk. Sometimes he brought small prey, rabbits, mice, which he dropped near Willow and the kitten without fuss. Other times, he came back with his fur dusted in pine needles and his eyes full of the forest. He never once tried to leave for good. Until the day he did. It was quiet that morning. Clear skies stretched above the pines, and the air smelled of thawing soil and cedar bark. Lena stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching Juniper wrestle with a pine cone under Willow's calm gaze. Ash stepped onto the porch beside her, silent as ever. She turned toward him, sensing it before she saw it in his eyes. "You're leaving," she said. He blinked, then looked toward the woods. There was no need for words. "You've done enough," she whispered, reaching out. Her hand brushed against the thick fur along his shoulder. Ash gave one soft huff of air and stepped down into the grass. Juniper looked up from her game, cocked her head, then trotted toward him. He touched noses with her once, briefly, almost formally, then turned toward Willow. The older bobcat gave a slow blink. He was saying goodbye. Lena stood motionless as Ash walked into the woods. His form blended quickly with the trees, his body becoming shadow, then movement, then nothing. But he didn't vanish without a sign. At the edge of the clearing, he paused. Looked back. And blinked, slowly, deeply, just once. Then disappeared. A few moments passed before Lena let out the breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She felt the ache of the goodbye, but not sadness. Not loss. What they had shared, across fire, years, snow, and silence, wasn't lost. It was written now into the forest itself. Later that evening, she stepped out onto the porch with Juniper at her heels, and looked toward the distant tree line. Somewhere out there, Ash was running again, free, wild, alive. But she knew, without doubt. He would always remember. Sometimes, the ones we save, come back to save us in return. Ash's story isn't just about a bobcat. It's about loyalty without language. About the kind of memory that isn't held in the brain, but in the heart. In a world that moves fast and forgets easily, this story reminds us that kindness leaves a mark, on animals, on people, and on places. Lena's act of compassion didn't end the day she carried a cub from the flames. It echoed for years, all the way through snow and storm, until it found its way back to her doorstep. That's the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return, but sometimes gets repaid in the most extraordinary ways. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe these stories are more than entertainment. They're reminders that empathy matters. That every quiet act of courage counts. If you believe in that too, join our growing community. Subscribe and stay for the stories that connect us. And here's your challenge, this week, do one selfless act for a creature, human or animal, who can't repay you. Then watch what happens when the wild remembers your kindness.